Okay, it was on like July 5th, which the day after it opened. I didn't know about, I sort of heard through the grapevine something was going to happen, but then it opened on July 4th, and then on the news that next day or something, they talked about women doing this, and I thought, oh, wow, right in my backyard, what is all this all about? You know, I mean, sounded really creative. It sounded, I was always involved with, I helped found the Women's Studies program here at the university when I was a graduate student here, so I was very involved with the women's movement right from the start, and then I'd always been involved with the peace movement back also from the 60s on, so I was in those locations, Columbia University, New York City, all the right places when things were just all starting to happen. So I was always a part of all of that. Plus I was always a photographer. So when this first happened, I thought, oh my goodness, this is really historically interesting here to bring together the women's movement and the peace movement in one place, and I could photograph this. And so I called up Ruth, who I had always been showing. We'd been sharing our photographs for a number of years. We were in a women's photography group with 3 other people, and over the course of the 70s really was when we were doing that. And then I came to Syracuse in 1974, so it was really the latter part of the 70s. So I said to her, why don't we think about going over there together and photographing this a little bit, and let's see what we get. But I also had a 5-month-old at the time and a 2-year-old. My children were born in 81 and 83, and I had continued always to do photography, but mostly focusing on them at that point because I was just busy, I couldn't do anything else, So I dragged these kids all the way over there. So we went over like that next weekend. I don't remember what day of the week the 4th was on, but as soon as I heard about it, like within a couple days, we went. And so we photographed the whole day, and all these people kept coming. It was this event where you could just. All these women were drawn to this peace camp from all over the world or all over the country, and then I couldn't believe that something significant was happening right here in upstate New York. I'd always sort of viewed Syracuse as not a hotbed of radicalism necessarily, but so I thought, well, this is really exciting. And so right after the first time we'd gone there, we both then decided that we would keep photographing it, and because I had to always bring my kids, and yet kids were welcome. It was not that hard to do, really. I had one on my back, pushing one here, and we realized right away that this was a very creative, new kind of venture, and pulling together both of these movements. So then I read all about, then I read about Green and Common, and I sort of caught up on my own history of it, and I realized what was behind it, what this was all about. And, I have several graduate degrees, so I do try to keep up with things, but I was definitely busy during that time with little kids. So
I'm curious, when you went and were taking photographs, were you able to participate in some of the activities between the kids and the cameras?
Yeah, we did, in the sense that I usually, to be perfectly frank, I use my camera as a way of both being inside something and outside something at the same time. So it allows me to be in it, but I can then step back. It gives me permission to be involved, but it also gives me permission to observe it and record it and say something and take a step outside of the circle. And so, and I've always played, I have that, I like playing that role. I like having that kind of balance in my life. I wouldn't have gone probably every week if I didn't have a camera. I wouldn't have gone that often or stayed over or done as much as other people might have done with 2 little kids that much if I didn't see myself as documenting it. And I thought this was historically significant, and I wanted to record that. You know, I wanted to document that, and that's what my photography has always been, you know.
When did you decide that there was a book there, that you wanted to do the book?
Oh, like about, maybe after about a month or so of going, when we saw that we kept going, and and then we kept seeing different people, and then we kept seeing different photographers, you know, more photographers. We started then seeing some of the same people also photographing. We saw people writing. You know, when you started to see how people were experiencing this, then we started saying, well, maybe we should think about collecting other people's works here and putting this together. I saw that. I mean, the other, partly my motivation is that in terms of my own personal history, I got a doctorate in 1979 from an interdisciplinary social science program here at this university, and I came here to do that thinking that I was going to be an academic person when I got done. And I finished in 1979, and that was the beginning of all the universities really pulling in their belts and downsizing. And so someone like me from an interdisciplinary program, my fields were sociology, psychology, you know, that sort of thing, and I had used a lot of visual material in my dissertation, and so I always tried to incorporate ways to use photography, and I ended up doing something with video for my dissertation, but not photography. And so I was always looking for a spot in a university where my strengths would be what I would teach, but it was a newer field, you know, to pull these different fields together. To do social science with a camera was like a new thing, you see. And so while that was an interesting intellectual thing to do, sort of structurally it wasn't going to happen in schools because they were all pulling in at that point. And so, and then I was in my late 30s at that time too, and that was why I had my kids at that time. So I saw this, so by pulling out of the university scene, Joel, my son, was born in '81, and then our daughter Alyssa was born in '83, and so for those years I was like not in academia. I was photographing what I wanted to and all, but in a way I was like getting off the train that you had to be on to have this career. And so what I thought was, if I make a photographic study of something and I do something that's that's on the level of being published, then that would be my entry back into academia. And so that was also part of my own motivation to come up with a book, although not when we first started doing it, but eventually I saw, oh yeah, this could be a project that'll help me get back into the workforce when my kids were older. And so that was my selfish reason for also doing the book. And you know, and that's why we went with an academic press, and you know, sort of was trying to be legitimate that way, you know. In the end, it didn't work out. You know, I never did enter academia the way I had intended to, and I always taught adjunct, and I always was on the outside of it all, and because we were stuck here in Syracuse, and there weren't any more places in the university. And I did teach visual sociology in the early 90s at the university, and I taught photography, and then I would teach sociology up at OCC, which is the community college here. So I always taught, and I always did this in piecemeal kind of fashion, but I never had that, you know, streamlined academic career that I was supposed to have when I started out, you know. So I just sort of saw this as a way of giving myself the credentials and the background, so that I, you know, thinking it was going to pay off that way, but it just didn't. you know, there were the outside events like the demonstrations and the marches and all that sort of thing, and then there was this life inside the camp. And because men were not allowed to be there, I thought that was really important to document daily life on some level, you know. So there was a picture that is not in this book that the publisher wouldn't put in, but of this one woman showering by the sinks over there, and so she's just pouring water over herself, and then so I did a lot of like how this camp was functioning, and how different individuals were doing that. That was one aspect. But then there were all the preparations for marches and making signs and making banners and whatever was going on, and food. You know, I did all the stuff around food. And then we marched with people, you know, along the road going up to the gate, and then we documented a couple of events up by the fences, and then as it got to be more dramatic, these marches up by the fence, and then as people were climbing over the fences, and as more things were happening and more events were occurring, and then as that counter demonstration stuff started taking off and getting a lot of publicity, it was really important that we wanted to photograph all of these aspects of everything. So I was always thinking in terms, I mean, as I said, within about 3 or 4 weeks, I realized there were like, you know, chapters of a book here, basically, you know, and so you had to sort of record everything that was happening. So I don't know if I had like a favorite kind of thing, but I just was thinking always in terms of this was a life of its own. You had to document how people's lives were being affected by this, and how they were affecting it. Too, by what their input was and what they got from it. So I was always looking at that. I knew that there were conflicts and difficulties, that people have very different political perspectives and had different agendas of why they were there and what they were doing, what they expected to come of this. And I didn't really want to know about that. I mean, I didn't want that to be part of what I was photographing. I wanted to document this sort of for historical purposes, you know. So I just felt that it was important to record that this whole thing happened over the course of these 12 weeks or whatever it was, and that this was history in the making. And then we tried to interview a lot of the people that we photographed after we would have photographed them, and we always tried to ask permission and make sure that everybody was cool about us photographing them. And you know, this one woman was, I remember thinking it was so funny, she was like digging they were putting up some sort of a pavilion or some sort of little structure, and here all these 3 or 4 people were all shoveling this dirt, you know, and 2 of them were totally naked doing this, you know. And I thought, this is just so interesting, you know, like this is, you know, to feel that safety of knowing that it didn't matter what you were wearing and what you looked like or anything, you know. And then I said to them right away, is it okay if I photo? Oh, sure, you can photograph us, you know. So, you know, like everyone was just very accepting, it seemed to me, of what we were doing. And that really has to do with, you know, what kind of contact you make with, you know, how you let them know that it's okay, that they can be safe with you photographing them. You know, I think that's its own little skill. You know, it takes time to develop that, but I like doing that, so.
And did you and Ruth, were you always there at the same time?
Well, we would go together, but we wouldn't necessarily be together out there. She would go off and do what she wanted, and I did what I wanted to do, and yeah, no, we pretty much went separately because we had our own photographic interests, and I don't like anybody around me when I'm photographing, you know. So it was fine, you know. We went in separate ways. You know, I have a small camera. I use a Leica camera, which is a really small, quiet camera. So I almost think that I'm invisible to them, you know, and that they don't even notice I'm doing this. So for the most part, if somebody told me they didn't want their photograph taken, then I just wouldn't do it. But but when we got up to the fence, there was this whole issue with feet back from the fence and the yellow line and all this other business. And, you know, it was really petty, so stupid, you know. And these guys, you know, these soldiers or whatever they were, saying, no, you can't step there. You can be here, but you can't be there, So, so I tried to sort of be in the middle of that and photograph all of that, sort of daring them a little bit. I was always daring them a little bit and seeing how far I could go. That's my role as an insider and an outsider, and that's how I identified myself, so that's how I would play it out. You get caught up in in the emotionality of everything pretty easily, so when things were happening, it felt like it was happening to you too, and so, so I don't know how to answer that other than that I've tried to always be as much inside and as much outside as I possibly could, always at the same time, which is, hard, impossible. But if I didn't have that way of being outside, I'm not sure how I would have felt. I'm very comfortable with the way I do it, I wouldn't risk arrest. I've always been careful because I was always afraid they would take my camera and I'd never see it again. Right, because that happened down in New York. We would get, there were arrests I was going to Columbia when that campus erupted, and I knew everything that could happen to people. I knew about arrests, I knew about beatings, I knew about everything, and so, and I didn't want to get arrested. I just didn't want to, I just didn't want to face that. Yeah. And I didn't have any money, and my camera cost a lot of money, and that was my big possession. It's the only thing I owned that I valued, and so I just didn't want to risk it, I didn't want them to step on it and break it on me or something, which I knew they could do. So I felt I was as much a part of it as I could handle, But I also wanted to document it. We went back and tried to photograph next year a little bit more, but it was a completely different experience, and so we didn't even include that in the book at all because we just thought that first summer was what was significant. I thought, I'll document this every summer, and keep kind of going along with this. But when I saw that the next year, I went to a couple meetings over the winter in which they were trying to have some discussion about what was going to happen next and that. And I saw there was some confusion about that and, no real set agenda, and it just didn't have the momentum behind it. So I thought, okay, well then I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. It gives you a slice of what it was like for people. I just wish it were, it was mostly Ruth and my project. She is not an academic, so I sort of really, I took the lead on this, on a lot of it. She has more of an artistic eye for certain things, and so we help put things together that way. But I think I was the one that really set out the chapters. I envisioned the whole thing from beginning to end. And so it was really Ruth and my project for a couple years to do that. And and I take a lot of credit for it. This wasn't published till '87. So it took us a couple of years to find the publisher who would then do it and go through all that. The process of doing the book happened from the fall after the camp closed. Then Ruth and I developed all our pictures, and we then, laid out a bunch of stuff. And she had a space at that time where we had a big, long table that went from that wall to that wall. I'm exaggerating, but it's, and we then started just moving material around of other people's work and our work, and that's when the chapters started to make sense and how it was going to happen, and which was not very far away from how you'd envision it in the beginning, but just not articulated, But once we had the materials, it just fell into place. It was a natural evolution, really. And then the materials themselves, moved in and out of the book, like we started, when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, does this picture really work with that text, and these pictures work together or not, or we don't have a picture of such and such, which would have belonged here. What do we have in our collection? What do we know other people might have that we could see if we could get to fit into that spot, So you know, so in that sense, and we spent that whole winter doing that. So by the next summer, we had pretty much a pretty decent idea of how it was going to lay out and what it would look like. And then that's when we involved in this other woman, Elaine, who then had publishing connections, and that's how she entered the scene. And so that's when we began. And then Ruth and I also started visiting other publishers that we could find around here. And we talked to them about this idea, how could we publish this, and mostly everybody turned us down that we saw around here. And then eventually Elaine had a connection to this Temple University Press, and then it went from there. I didn't want it to drag on. It wasn't going to be a scrapbook kind of thing. It wasn't going to be overkill, you know. I wanted it to be succinct and point, you know. I saw it initially really, I mean, if you think in terms of a photographic book, you know, you're not talking about more than 100 pages, you know. So that was sort of my limit. It wasn't very scientific because there were a lot of people who took photographs who we were never in touch with because we just weren't there. But when we saw that we were, that we couldn't possibly document what really everything that needed to be included in a book. When we saw that we wanted to make a book, but we couldn't really gather that ourselves, that's when we then would see other people photographing, and we would then ask them if they would be willing to be part of a project. And so we did. So then we started getting their names and addresses, and then we wrote them, and then in that fall, I mean, we told them what we were thinking of doing so that there wasn't a big surprise there. And then in the fall, we just wrote everybody letters, and we said, this is what we want to do. Can you send us whatever you have? And these are our categories, and these are our chapters, and whatever you are willing to give us, we're willing to work with you. And so they did. And then we said, we can't promise to pay you. We don't really know how this is going to work out. But what we ended up doing was getting an advance. When we got a so-called advance from the publisher, when we finally did get a publisher, we got like $1,000 or something like this. And so we sent all the photographers and all the contributors $25, and it used up all our money. So that was our payment to them. So we got nothing out of it, you know. We got a couple books out of it, you know. And then we had to buy books after that. You know, we couldn't even. They gave us each 3 books or 4 books or something like that. And then after that, we had to buy them ourselves. You know, so it was very strange. They sent them to. They have standing orders with university presses, with university libraries. So they all went out to university libraries and some places, some bookstores in Rochester. We asked them to market it and promote it, at least in the New York area. And they kind of did, they kind of didn't, you know. They didn't really take it all that seriously. And then, and that was it. And then they finally, a whole year went by, and there was no reprinting, nothing. And then they, and it was in their, they had a catalog that they put out where they write a good write-up of each book that comes out 4 times a year, so of all their new books. So, you know, I thought, well, maybe when that happens, you know, there'll be something, but it didn't. And then finally they remandered it to a place in West Virginia where some guy, I really don't know how that works, but something in which all the books that are left over that don't get sold, they throw in a box and they bring them to this guy in West Virginia where this publisher has an arrangement with them, and so if you want books, you can buy them from him, so they're cheaper. So Ruth and I each bought a box, which we then gave out to people, you know, and now we have a few left each, and that's it. We don't have any more. I just have a couple that I keep in a box that, you know, are still pretty new. And then, and she has the same, and then that's it. Well, yeah, like there were women from here. There were like these direct action women, you know, the affinity groups from here. And so there were different women from the Women's Information Center, from the Peace Group, from Peace Council. You know, there were pockets of women who we knew and who would participate in all of these. And you know, so we always talked about it, you know, whenever we would cross paths, and we talked about, well, who jumped over the fence and who did this action and who did that action. But I didn't make new friends there. I mean, I didn't meet other people. I just it was more the people that I already knew, kind of. Well, we got some thank you notes from the women whose works were included, the photographers, when they all got sent a book and everything, and some people thanked us for that and was glad that they were pleased with how it looked, and you know, that they were included and that sort of thing. I always had the feeling that the people at the encampment didn't necessarily feel that they didn't. It's hard to say this. I'm not sure how to say it, but I never felt, because I was never a real insider. You know, we were never the inside group. I mean, I felt like they just sort of said, okay, go ahead, go do that, you know, but we're not really with you on this, you know, like if you want to do this, I could see where they could see that we were like the press coming in doing this, you know, like we were outsiders, like looking in, and I didn't want to be viewed that way, but I sort of sensed that that's how they treated it, like they didn't care about, I didn't think that they cared about it, and so I never pushed for their feedback or felt that I really wanted to hear that they might have not liked what we did.